Hi, so lots of you have asked me for OCR GCSE English Literature revision materials because there's not a huge amount online. So I've mocked up a little practice paper and I'm very happy making more of them. We're just going to look at the poetry questions. There are two poetry questions on the paper. You need to answer both of them. And you need to answer the conflict poetry questions because that's the cluster of poems you've been using. Those are the 15 poems you need to know. And these two questions come in two parts, two tasks you need to do. The second task is the easier one. Explore in detail from one other poem of your anthology which presents, and in the example I've chosen, death, but it will be something that's to do with conflict or, something that allows you to talk about more than one poem in the cluster, although your second essay is only asking you to write on one poem. I'm going to focus today on how to answer the A part of that. Now, the A part of that is a much trickier essay. Compare how these two poems present ideas about something, in this case, death. And it will say you should consider ideas and attitudes in each poem, tone and atmosphere in each poem, the effects of language and structure used. Now, for this question, you're given one poem from the anthology that you must write about and one poem that will be completely unseen. So, in this paper, I've chosen The Destruction of Sennacherib because I really like the poem, and I picked another poem to act as the unseen. Now, it's always worth, when looking at paper, just looking at the key word. And I would, or the key term, the key idea you're being asked to write about. So I would, in my exam paper, just underline that key phrase, present ideas about death. Now, it uses the term present ideas. Now, anytime you see present, it's asking you to talk, present how something presents. It's asking you to talk about AO2. AO2, remember, is the language of the poem, the structure of the poem, how the poem is written, any individual ideas, any individual techniques, rather. And AO1 is ideas. This question is not asking for AO3. AO3 is your contextual knowledge, your knowledge about the world in which the poet writes. However, context is always quite useful in understanding the ideas behind a poem, and it will be marked always on AO1. So some amount of context can be used, but of course with the unseen poem, you won't know the context of it. You're just getting the unseen poem. So, first thing to do, remind myself of the ideas about death, because death is my key theme in The Destruction of Sennacherib. I've got this now. What do I know about the destruction of Sennacherib? Well, I know that it's in quatrains. It stands as 4 lines long, and it's in anapestic tetrameter, which is ba-ba-bum, 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 ba-ba-bum. So I can see that now. The Syrian came down like Syrian came down like wolf on like the wolf on the fold. But I think the stress is actually there. Syrian came down like the wolf on the fold. Down. So, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold. Perp is our stress syllable, and gold always ends with a stress here. and the sheen of their spears was like stars on the sea when the blue waves roll nightly on deep Galilee. Well, how does that structure allow us to think about the idea of death? Well, an anapestic tetrameter is quite a fast structure. It presents this idea of continual motion, and we could say that this anapestic structure reflects both the might of the Assyrian army and, of course, their sudden, unexplainable deaths. Now, because Byron is a romantic poet, he's very interested in ideas of the sublime. Now, the sublime is an emotional feeling, a response to seeing that things in the world, nature is vastly bigger than you. Now, in the story that the destruction of Sennacherib tells, which is a story from the Old Testament. It's particularly noticeable in the second book of Kings, and it appears somewhere else in the Old Testament as well. The Assyrian army come out of the blue, in huge numbers and surround Jerusalem. And the people of Jerusalem, the people of Judea, the Jews, are in this city and expect to be destroyed. The Assyrian army vastly outnumber them. They're much, much stronger than them. Jerusalem has no hope. However, God intervenes, and God destroys the uh, the Assyrian army overnight. And the following morning, you know, waiting for the destruction of Judea, the Jews look out across from Jerusalem on their walls and they see actually that it's the Assyrian army who are all dead. Now, in the Bible, of course, this is all given to God's power. Byron doesn't do that. Byron puts this character, the angel of death, as being the destroying force of the Assyrian army. Now, the angel of death, of course, is just death. It's the, death destroys the Assyrian army. It's as simple as that. But in the angel of death, death has been personified. Death has become a supernatural force. It's been, yeah. Would you call that personification? If it's not really a person, I think we could probably use that. I think OCR will be very happy marking it as being the example of the personification of death. So, what do we see here? What are our ideas about death in this poem? Well, our first idea is that death is unpredictable. None of the Assyrian army expect to die. They expect to defeat Jerusalem. Death is unpredictable and uncontrollable. And your idea about the sublime there, of course, death is far more powerful. Humans and humanity. It is a sublime force. And anytime you get these any of these poems, first thing to do from your lessons and your revision, just note down on your sheet what are your two big ideas. Now we come to the unseen. Now, there'll always be a link between the seen and the unseen, the poem you know and the poem you don't know. And you know what the link is? It's death. So the examiner is expecting you to read this poem while thinking about death. And the poem reads like this: Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow die not, poor Death, nor yet canst thou kill me. An interesting idea. Death can't kill the writer. Surely that can't be true. John Donne, I've checked it out, he's very dead. So what does he mean here? From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go. So our best men die, rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy or charms can make us sleep as well. And better than thy stroke, why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Okay, so with our unseen poem, we're always going to have to read it a couple of times to see if we can get the poem's meaning, its core idea. And that's always a thing with a new poem. You know, don't worry if you don't understand it the first time around. Have a think, have a pause. Most powerful thing you can do, reread it. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. Okay, this is clearly an idea here, isn't it? Some have called thee mighty and dreadful, but thou art not so. Death, John Donne is saying, is not mighty and dreadful. Then jot that down, because that's the exact opposite from what Lord Byron is thinking about with death. With Lord Byron, the idea of death is far greater than humanity, and death is terrifying. That angel of death, and then that sort of zoom in, that real focus on the detail of the dead horse and rider, they make death seem really, really terrible. But Donne, and we can see it's directed to death. He's talking to death. Donne tells death. So it's another of these forms of personification. You know, Donne is talking to death as a concept, but he's really talking to death as though death is a person, or indeed as though death is that angel of death. Donne tells death that it is not mighty and dreadful. And why does Donne think that? Well, as we go on, those thou think'st us overthrow die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. All right, strange, weird. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. Okay, so now we're getting an idea. And the idea is this: that death is not mighty and dreadful, because death is not in charge of its own actions, it's a slave. You are a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. Now, an idea here, because I'm always thinking about that idea of the destruction of Sennacherib, I've always got that in the back of my mind, is this contradiction, which is that death can be controlled by men, caused by any number of things, including fate and chance. So these are out of men's controls, but also humans. And if death does what humans tell it to do, death is not stronger than humanity, death is weaker than humanity. And does with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and popular charms can make us sleep as well. And better than thy stroke, why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death thou shalt die. Now, I have a little bit of contextual knowledge that I can apply here, which is that this is clearly a Christian poem. It's called Holy Sonnets. It's written in English, always a good guess. And this idea, there's a short sleep past, and then we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. So this idea that humans actually conquer death because humans live eternally. Once they die, they have the possibility of eternal life in heaven. Now, the destruction of Sennacherib is also a Christian poem, although it doesn't focus as much on, I say it's a Jewish poem. It's from the Old Testament. It's based on the story of the Jews. The New Testament is sort of Christian, but obviously the Bible contains the Old and New Testament. Christianity evolves from Judaism. But there isn't so much of a focus, actually, on this idea of Christianity or eternal life. Death feels like an end there. The last stanza, of course, of the destruction of Sennacherib, and keep going back and forwards while you're thinking of your answer. And the widows of Asher are loud in their wail, and the idols are broken, the temple of Baal. As we said here, Asher's a major Assyrian city, Baal is a major Assyrian god. Um, and the idea of the idols being broken, of course, that's a reference to the commandment, thou shalt not worship false idols. So this idea that the Assyrian religion has been entirely destroyed by this destruction of the army. And the might of the Gentile, unsmoked by the sword, has melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. So there are Jews and Gentiles. The Assyrians are Gentiles, and the strength, the might of the Gentile has been melted like snow. The strength of those who are not Jews has vanished entirely. It's been unsmoked by the sword, meaning that there's been no actual conflict here between human armies. It's actually melted like snow in the glance of the Lord. So we've got this idea of God protecting the Jewish people. Now that idea is an AO1 idea, and we can see it here. And as I say, Byron comes from a Christian tradition, but the Christian tradition also includes the history of Judaism. And so both of these poems can clearly be called Christian poems. But let's say I can't make that link. Let's say I haven't spotted that in an exam, which is, not unreasonable for me not to spot. I'm an atheist, so the possibility of me spotting religious imagery is weak. And many of you, this won't be your religion if you have a religion. So you might not necessarily notice how Christian certainly this unseen poem is, and indeed how Christian a lot of the poems in your OCR anthology are. So we're going to work without that. We're just going to talk about the ideas. So the two poems This is how we're going to start our essay. So the first thing we write is our thesis statement. And our thesis statement gives us the main ideas of the poems, how they're similar or how they're different about death. The two poems present death in contrasting ways. Sometimes, if they present the idea in a similar way, we'll say similar ways. The two poems present death in contrasting ways. In the destruction, and we always put poems in single inverted commas, of Sennacherib, come on, Byron presents death as a sublime force which overpowers the human army of the Assyrians, and leads to their total and unexpected destruction. That's the idea in our first poem. And then our contrasting statement, done, however, and we only use however if these poems are presenting very different ideas. Done, however, considers death to be a weak force which is a slave to many things, including the actions of humans. In this way, we can consider Byron as placing death as superior to humanity, and terrifying as a result of it, and done suggesting that death is inferior to humanity and that humans should not fear death. So those are our AO1s. We've got our key ideas out of the way in our thesis statement. We're going to keep those in mind, but after this, we're going to write the paragraphs that contain our AO2s, our analysis of language, form, and structure. So, and the way to do this, easiest way, talk about the first poem, then talk about the second poem, then go back to talking about the first poem, then go back to talking about the second poem. So, let's start with the first poem. Byron writes the destruction of Sennacherib in anabastic tetrameter, a rapid meter which combined with the rhyming couplets gives the poem a feeling of speed and unstoppable force. Okay, back to death. Mirroring the rapid movement of the angel of death. Angel of death through the Assyrian army. Okay, let's go back to the angel of death. So, we also need to show that we know poetic terminology. Now, obviously, we do because we've used words like anapestic tetrameter. We've talked about the meter. Also going to need to talk about stanzas. In the third stanza, a key moment in the poem, Byron says, the angel death those words again, spread his wings on the blast. Angel of death spread his wings on the blast. Breathed in the face of the foe as he passed. Okay, and another thing with writing of poems, we show that there's a break in the line. We show going on to a new line by using a slash. And breathed in the face of the foe as he passed. Just going to check that quotation is 100% accurate. Now, because this is a, yeah, absolutely. Because the second question is asking about an unseen poem, sorry, the second question, not an unseen poem, the second question is asking about a poem that you have from memory. The examiners aren't going to expect necessarily your quotes to be 100% accurate. They have to be pretty accurate because apart from anything else, if you've got an inaccurate quote and then you analyse a word from it and the word isn't in the poem, you're not going to get those AO2 marks. But with that first question, because we've got both of those poems, we should make sure our quotes are 100% accurate. You know, don't worry too much if you can just about remember the quote, but you're not 100% sure of it when answering the second question. But when answering the first question, just make sure you get it absolutely right, because it's one of those things about reading an examiner. And you don't want the examiner to think, when you've got a quote wrong from a poem that's in front of you, that you're lazy. Because examiners are people. They are teachers, and they want to categorize you as quickly as possible into, you know, an elite student, a successful student, an unsuccessful student, or a bit of a waste of space. And I'm afraid if you're making errors about quotations on a poem in front of you, they're beginning to think you're a bit of a waste of space, and they'll be thinking of putting you in one of those lower bands. Breathed on the face of the foe as he passed. Okay, so I picked those two lines because I can analyse language in them. So, in the form of the angel of death, and as I said, I'm not 100% sure if you're talking about angels, whether you'd use the term personification. I don't actually know of another term that you would use. And I think, in general, any examiner is going to give you the benefit of the doubt with personification. I know I always would when I'm examining for AQA. The angel of death. Death. Death is personified. Personified And the verb breathed shows how casually destructive, powerful death is. So, breathed. Now, the angel of death doesn't, strike them down with lightning bolts. It just breathes on them. So it's casually destructive. With the words as he passed, Byron emphasizes how easy death finds the destruction of humans and suggests that death is uncaring and indifferent to indifferent means again basically uncaring to the to the suffering that is caused. I'm not going to write this whole essay because I don't actually think that it's going to be a very engaging video or at a manageable length if I go on and write what I'd write in 45 minutes. Well, actually, yeah, 45 minutes. But I'm going to look and see something about the other poem. Now, for students who want that grade 9, it's worth working out how to do meter. If you're watching that video, I'm assuming you're one of those students who wants at least a grade 7. Because if you're a lazy student, you won't be at this point in the video. So, first trick, just count the syllables in a line. Death be not proud, though some have called thee. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Weird one. Mighty. 1, 2, 3. And dreadful. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 syllables. For those whom thou thinkst. 5. Thou dost overthrow. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 9. 9 syllables again. Die not. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So they're 9 or 10 syllables long, from rest and sleep, which that but thy pictures be. Now, when we have a 9-syllable line, it's usually because the line is catalectic. That means that it's missing a syllable. And that's because the usual measure of poems is 10 syllables or 8 syllables. Because most poems you'll find, if they have a meter at all, are iambic. It's the easiest one to guess. But in order to test it, we just need to find a few of those lines. Die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. So iambic is bu-bum, 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 bu-bum. Now you'll notice it's not always perfect in that iambic pentameter because we've got some of those catalectic lines. Mighty, and dreadful, but for thou art not so. But it's roughly that rhythm, just about. So we're going to call that iambic pentameter. And what you'd do on a paper, is you'd actually use what we call slash and brev notation. So you'd put a little like an acute accent, a little slash above where the stressed syllables are, and a little U above where the unstressed syllables are. I'm just doing it in bold, but I can see what that rhythm is. You can see that's iambic pentameter. You know, you can do well without being able to do meter, but you'll do better. You'll get into that top band if you can reliably tell meter. So done uses iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter. Now we know that this title is Holy Sonnets, so we know it's a sonnet. But if we didn't know it was a sonnet, we've seen that's iambic pentameter. We can just count the lines. There are 14 lines there. It's going to be a sonnet. Pretty reliable way of telling. Donne uses iambic pentameter, and the sonnet form to present a weak death which humans triumph over. Okay, so what about iambic rhythms? What is it that makes them special? If we said that anapaestic rhythms are very fast because they're naturally quite breathless, well, iambic rhythms are actually much slower. Bum 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 bum. Lots of people will tell you that iambic rhythms, iambic pentameter, mirrors this sound of human heartbeats. A human heartbeat. It does, and it mirrors the sound of a human heartbeat when the heart is quite strong, quite confident, and quite calm. The iambic pentameter provides a slower, calmer, and more confident rhythm than Byron's, showing the certainty. Iambic pentameter, it's often used to show certainty, showing the certainty of the speaker in, in directly addressing death. Similarly, so yeah, we're spotting a similarity here between the poems. Death can be viewed as personified, and in this poem, Byron, not Byron, Donne. Donne, we always use writers' surnames, by the way, never their first names. Donne seems to rebuke. Now, rebuke means to tell off. Rebuke death, instructing in the opening words, death be not proud. Death be not proud. That means death, don't be proud. You know, death shouldn't be arrogant or overconfident because death actually is very weak. Death be not proud. In in Donne's poem, there is a certainty that humans will triumph over death. As this can be seen in the phrase "for thou art not so," which undermines adjectives mighty and dreadful. And dreadful. So, the next thing I talk about is this list. Death is presented as a slave in the poem to coincidence or the actions of humans. This noun weakens force of death reducing it to something which has no agency. Agency is a really big idea. Agency is the ability to make decisions for yourself. And Dunn is saying that death doesn't make any decisions about for itself. It's just sent to where it's sent to. Um, I'd go on, talk about this list, and talk about that final phrase, "death thou shalt die," in the paragraph 4, because in paragraph 3, I'd go back and talk about something in the destruction of Sennacherib. I'd probably talk about the two stanzas which focus on the horse and rider. Or I might talk about, if I thought about that connection with both of them as being inspired by Christian imagery, I might talk about the final stanza and compare those poems' endings. These aren't the only ways to compare poems, but it's a pretty good way. Reliably get the results. So as I say, that's most of an essay. 2 more paragraphs and you can finish it. Don't need to write conclusions at the end of essays. Don't write concluding paragraphs. All right, I hope that was reasonably helpful for you. And good luck in your upcoming PPEs. Goodbye.